The 7 questions that end doubt, Buddha's method. The standard passage in praise of the Buddha's Dhamma states that it is sanditiko, to be seen here and now. And 647 explains this term with an illustration. One can see when the Dhammas he teaches about, skillful and unskillful qualities, are present or absent in the mind. The practical implication of this principle is that doubt about the Dhamma cannot be overcome simply through force of conviction. Instead, it is overcome through investigation into the mind in the present, equipped with questions that focus on the issue of what events in the mind are skillful or not. The Buddha makes this point by implication in SN 4651, where he states that uncertainty is starved by the same activity that feeds the analysis of qualities, dhamma-vicaya, as a factor for awakening, fostering appropriate attention to qualities that are skillful and unskillful, blameworthy and blameless, gross and refined, siding with darkness and with light. Thus, the proper investigation of the mind in the present is done with questions framed in terms that deserve categorical answers. And, as it turns out, these are precisely the sorts of questions that the Buddha encourages in the final 2 situations in which he employs the strategy of cross-questioning. The questions he asks his listeners about their experience in the present, and the questions he recommends they ask themselves. Because the questions appropriate to these 2 situations are so similar, and in many instances actually overlap, we will discuss the 2 situations as one: self-cross-examination. Skill in questions, cross-questioning. Given that skillful questions of self-cross-examination foster the analysis of qualities as a factor of awakening, and given that this factor is equated with discernment, it is only fitting that these questions build on the questions that MN 135 says are most conducive to the arising of discernment. What is skillful, venerable sir? What is unskillful? What is blameworthy? What is blameless? What should be cultivated? What should not be cultivated? What, having been done by me, will be for my long-term harm and suffering? Or what, having been done by me, will be for my long-term benefit and happiness? On the beginning level, the questions of self-cross-examination continue the thrust of these questions, seeking to identify what is skillful and unskillful in general terms. Then they shift focus more to the particulars of one's own activities, showing how to observe one's intentions and actions and the results of those intentions and actions, both in the immediate present and over time, so as to judge whether they are actually skillful or not. Ultimately, they pursue this line of inquiry into more and more subtle levels of activity in the mind until they can uproot the subtlest levels of attachment, thus bringing about the total freedom of unbinding. When we compare these types of cross-questioning with the 6th and 7th types listed in the preceding chapter, exploring hypotheticals, we see that their formal relationship parallels the relationship between the 2 major stages in the first type, cross-examining a monk accused of an offense against the Vinaya. In the preliminary stage of a Vinaya cross-examination, a learned monk is questioned about the rules relevant to the planned accusation in a way that, 1, establishes, for those who may have not yet learned it, the general framework of principles on which the specific action is to be judged, and 2, reminds those who have learned the framework of points they may have forgotten. In a similar way, the act of cross-questioning a listener about a hypothetical analogy or example is meant to remind the listener of a framework or pattern with which he is already familiar, and to establish the fact that the framework is useful for understanding a specific teaching or answer. In other words, this type of cross-questioning is an aid to mindfulness, in the canonical sense of the word, calling something to mind and keeping it there. The obvious difference is that in a Vinaya cross-examination, the framework is provided by a set body of rules, whereas in the act of exploring a hypothetical, it's provided by the listener's personal range of knowledge and skills. However, in the second stage of a Vinaya cross-examination, the actual cross-examination of the accused, the questions are aimed at ferreting out particular actions so that they can be judged against general principles as to whether they constitute an offense. This is the basic pattern of the self-cross-examination covered in this chapter. Particular actions and mind states, also viewed as actions, are ferreted out so that they can be judged as skillful or not. The major difference here is that in a Vinaya cross-examination, if the action is judged as an offense, the monk is penalized by his fellows so that he can achieve restraint in the future. Whereas in self-cross-examination, when an activity is judged as unskillful, the response is largely an individual matter. Seeing the harm the action entails, one tries to achieve restraint, preferably in the present, but if not, in the future, on one's own initiative. Thus, in simple terms, the exploration of hypotheticals uses cross-questioning to remind the listener of general principles and to establish their relevance, whereas self-cross-examination uses cross-questioning to ferret out specific actions with the purpose of judging them against general principles that have already been established, but whose implications in practice are still being mastered. Although both types of cross-questioning aim ultimately at greater discernment, they approach that discernment through different proximate aims: improved understanding and mindfulness in the case of exploring hypotheticals, and heightened alertness in the case of self-cross-examination. When this trio of mental qualities, understanding, mindfulness, and alertness, is combined with ardency in abandoning unskillful qualities and developing skillful ones, the mind is imbued with the qualities it needs to develop the path factor of right mindfulness leading to right concentration and release. This is how the process of self-cross-examination fosters the standard factors of the path. As we noted in the introduction, self-cross-examination can function as a way of testing the initial frame of one's questions. If all the possible answers suggested by a particular way of framing questions do not pass the test, the frame has to be readjusted or replaced. This was one of the ways the Bodhisattva had to employ this sort of questioning in his quest for awakening, as he kept refining his ideas of what is skillful and not. When he became the Buddha, he was thus able to provide his students with a reliable way of framing the initial questions related to the issue of stress and its end. Because he was so confident in the reliability of those questions, he invited his students to test them through self-cross-examination for themselves, although this testing often measures not only the validity of the Buddha's framework of categorical questions, but also the validity of one's own comprehension of that framework. This is one of the uses of self-cross-examination on the path. The other is to employ self-cross-examination as a strategy for determining how best to apply the Buddha's teachings in actual practice. The questions the Buddha recommends in this area perform this task in two ways: by investigating how one is actually applying those teachings, and by providing standards for measuring the success of that application. Thus, self-cross-examination, when conducted skillfully, is the process by which a student of the Buddha's teaching can develop the level of alertness and discernment needed to become independent in the Dhamma. It so happens that when we extract from the discourses the passages giving instruction in self-cross-examination and arrange them in ascending order from the most basic to those resulting immediately in release, we find that they begin and end with passages in which the Buddha, when asked a question, puts the question aside and then proceeds to lead his listeners in the process of self-cross-examination. In the first passage, the listeners end up taking refuge in the Triple Gem. In the second, many of the listeners reach full awakening. There is apparently no intended symmetry in these two passages. They are widely separated in the canon. But this formal parallel does draw attention to the point that questions to be put aside are put aside for just this reason. They get in the way of the self-examination that is most effective for progress on the path. In the first instance, in 366, the famous discourse to the Calamus informed the Buddha that they have heard many teachers disparaging one another's teachings and would like to know which of these teachers are lying and which are telling the truth. The Buddha puts the question aside and questions the Calamus about which activities they have observed to be skillful and unskillful. The way in which he conducts the questioning shows that these activities are to be judged by the beneficial or harmful results they lead to, and whether those results are praised or blamed by the wise. The implications of this line of cross-questioning are twofold. On the one hand, the Buddha is asserting the pragmatic principle that a teaching is to be judged by the results that come from putting it into practice. This is a principle he expands on in 853 and in 780. On the other hand, he is also implying that a teacher is to be judged by his or her actions. After all, if the counsel of the wise is to be taken into consideration, one must have some criteria for judging who is wise and who isn't. Thus, in MN 95, he provides some of these criteria, and here it's important to note that these criteria are expressed in the form of self-cross-examination. One is responsible for observing a potential teacher's behavior, and so, instead of asking a teacher point-blank as to whether he or she can be trusted, is encouraged to quiz oneself as to what one has observed in the teacher's behavior in these terms. Are there in this venerable one any such qualities based on greed, aversion, delusion that, with his mind overcome by these qualities, he might say, "I know," while not knowing, or say, "I see," while not seeing? Or that he might urge another to act in a way that was for his, her long-term harm and pain. As the Buddha points out in 4U192, one can come to a reliable conclusion on these questions only when one is highly observant, and only after observing the other person in a wide variety of situations over a long period of time. Thus, in the act of choosing a teacher, one must be judicious rather than judgmental, taking the responsibility of being both observant and willing to invest a fair amount of time in assessing the teacher's behavior. Some later schools of Buddhism argued that a student would be in no position to judge a teacher, and that the act of judging others is unskillful in any event, but the Buddha himself did not adopt that attitude at all. The pursuit of truth requires a responsible attitude, which begins by taking responsibility for one's choice of a teacher. If the teacher's behavior is clearly unskillful, and one chooses that person for a teacher nevertheless, one is showing a highly irresponsible attitude toward the issue of skillful behavior in general. If one is willing to turn a blind eye to a teacher's unskillful behavior, one will probably also want to turn a blind eye to one's own. With the questions of MN 95, we move from the area of defining skillful and unskillful in general terms, and into the area of judging the skillfulness of particular actions. MN 61 is probably the most important discourse on this level of self-cross-examination, in that it not only frames the questions that one should ask when judging the skillfulness of one's actions, but also places these questions in a larger context to show how they can best be used to learn from one's mistakes and purify one's actions through practice and observation. To begin with, one's actions, physical, verbal, and mental, are to be examined at 3 points in time, when intending to do them, while doing them, and after they are done. This sequence relates to 2 important points in understanding the nature of action. It follows A, the principle that intention constitutes the action, and B, the principle of that conditionality, that actions can show their results both in the immediate present and over time. As we noted in Chapter 4, the way in which the Buddha encourages judging one's actions both by the intention motivating them and by the results they yield parallels the way a craftsperson judges a work in progress, learning from mistakes in a way that yields ever-improving results and heightened skill. Second, this examination is to be done not alone, but with the help of a teacher. When one finds that one's physical or verbal actions have been unskillful, one should consult a teacher or knowledgeable friend on the path. This consultation accomplishes two things. It encourages a truthful attitude toward admitting one's mistakes, and it opens the opportunity to gain helpful advice from the knowledgeable friend. In this way, the practice of skillfulness, like the act of teaching and learning in general, becomes a cooperative effort. At the same time, this consultation saves time and energy in that one is not forced to reinvent the Dhamma wheel after every mistake. Perhaps most important of all, the context outlined in MN 61 shows the proper attitudes to bring to bear in the self-cross-examination of one's actions. The first is truthfulness. Right before outlining the questions to use in self-cross-examination, the Buddha uses a series of vivid images to impress on his son, Rahula, how important truthfulness is. Then the Blessed One, having left a little bit of the remaining water in the water dipper, said to Ven, Rahula, Rahula, do you see this little bit of remaining water left in the water dipper? Yes, sir. That's how little of a contemplative there is in anyone who feels no shame at telling a deliberate lie. Having tossed away the little bit of remaining water, the Blessed One said to Ven, Rahula, Rahula, do you see how this little bit of remaining water is tossed away? Yes, sir. Rahula, whatever there is of a contemplative in anyone who feels no shame at telling a deliberate lie is tossed away just like that. Having turned the water dipper upside down, the Blessed One said to Ven, Rahula, Rahula, do you see how this water dipper is turned upside down? Yes, sir. Rahula, whatever there is of a contemplative in anyone who feels no shame at telling a deliberate lie is turned upside down just like that. Having turned the water dipper right side up, the Blessed One said to Ven, Rahula, Rahula, do you see how empty and hollow this water dipper is? Yes, sir. Rahula, whatever there is of a contemplative in anyone who feels no shame at telling a deliberate lie is empty and hollow just like that. Rahula, it's like a royal elephant, immense, pedigreed, accustomed to battles, its tusks like chariot poles. Having gone into battle, it uses its forefeet and hind feet, its forequarters and hindquarters, its head and ears and tusks and tail, but will just hold back its trunk. The elephant trainer notices that and thinks, this royal elephant has not given up its life to the king. But when the royal elephant, having gone into battle, uses its forefeet and hind feet, its forequarters and hindquarters, its head and ears and tusks and tail and his trunk, the trainer notices that and thinks, this royal elephant has given up its life to the king. There is nothing it will not do. In the same way, Rahula, when anyone feels no shame in telling a deliberate lie, there is no evil, I tell you, he will not do. Thus, Rahula, you should train yourself. I will not tell a deliberate lie, even in jest. MN 61. Just as with other forms of cross-questioning, self-cross-examination needs to be based on the intellectual, ethical virtue of truthfulness, if it is to succeed in getting at the truth of one's unskillful habits and replacing them with skillful ones. Another quality basic to self-cross-examination is conviction in four things: in the power of one's actions to yield results, in one's ability to evaluate those results, in the importance of making these judgments, and in one's ability to learn and benefit from them. We noted above that conviction on its own cannot overcome doubt about the Dhamma. Nevertheless, The process of investigation cannot get off the ground without the conviction that it is a worthwhile, or even feasible, activity. This is why the Buddha took such pains to refute those who taught doctrines, such as determinism, that deny the efficacy of action. For in a universe devoid of choice or immune to the effects of action, there is no possibility of learning from one's mistakes. This is also why he stated in AN 219 that if it weren't possible or beneficial to abandon unskillful behavior and develop skillful behavior, he wouldn't have advocated these courses of action. The discourses as a whole, as in SN 4810 and N 1092, define conviction as conviction in the Buddha's awakening. This does not mean conviction simply in the fact of his awakening, but also in the path that took him there. As we noted in Chapter 2, this path was a path of self-cross-examination. Thus, an important component of conviction in the Buddha's awakening is that self-cross-examination of one's actions is not only possible, but also the only way to true happiness. Other attitudes implicit in the strategy of self-cross-examination advocated in MN 61 include compassion, in the desire not to harm oneself or others, integrity, in the ability to take responsibility for one's mistakes, and a healthy sense of shame, i.e., the shame toward unworthy actions that grows from high self-esteem. Above all, however, this process of self-cross-examination is motivated by an attitude of heedfulness, a sense of the importance of one's actions, of the dangers of unskillful action, of the rewards of developing skillful actions, and of the care needed to develop what is skillful and to abandon what is not. Without this heedfulness, the examination of one's actions would not necessarily lead to any improvement in one's behavior. One would simply note the presence or absence of skillful qualities and leave it at that. This is why the Buddha said that heedfulness is the root of all skillfulness. Goodness comes not from any innate goodness in the mind, but from a keen sense of the dangers of the unskillful habits already there, and the benefits of the skillful habits that one can develop in their place. Thus, many of the questions recommended on this level of self-cross-examination build on MN 61 by inducing an urgent sense of heedfulness in uncovering unskillful mental actions and abandoning them as quickly and effectively as possible. And it's important to note that the role of mindfulness in this self-cross-examination is not simply to note the presence or absence of particular mental states. Just as its role in MN 117 is to keep in mind the need to abandon the factors of the wrong path and develop the factors of the right, here its role is to stay focused relentlessly on the need to abandon any unskillful states that appear. An important feature of the self-cross-examination outlined in MN 61 is that it treats mental actions under the same framework as physical and verbal actions. In other words, events in the mind are to be regarded as a form of karma, deriving from intentions, either skillful or not, and leading to results, either desirable or not. As with physical and verbal actions, these causal relationships can be observed and used as lessons in the pursuit of ever higher levels of skillful mental action. And 1051 shows how this can be done in a general way, highlighting with a list of cross-questions features of mental activity that are important to keep in mind for this purpose. SN 47-8 and SN 47-10 show how a similar process can be applied specifically to the practice of meditation, demonstrating how to read the mind to see which meditative approaches are working and which are not, so as to use that knowledge in developing the practice of mindfulness to ever more refined levels of concentration. Even though these passages don't list explicit questions, implicit questions obviously lie behind the points the meditator should look for in reading his or her own mind. Is the mind settling down? Are the hindrances being abandoned? If not, what alternative approaches might work in bringing the mind to stillness? The habit of looking at meditative states in the context of karma, intention, and result is an important habit to develop, for without it there is a tendency to view states of stillness, and especially the formless states, as embodying metaphysical principles. For example, an experience of the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness can easily be misread as an experience of the oneness of the cosmos, or a ground of being. An experience of the dimension of nothingness can be misread as a confirmation that nothing really exists. But as MN 121 shows, these states are best viewed as a form of action, intentionally focused on a perception, which, because of the element of intention, inevitably involves stress or disturbance, however subtle. If, after learning how to settle into a meditative state, the meditator can focus on the questions implicit in this approach. Where is the element of stress or disturbance here? How does it compare with the degree of disturbance in other modes of perception? What action is causing it? These questions can prevent any metaphysical misinterpretations of the states attained, and can instead focus on how to abandon actions that are causing subtle levels of stress. As MN 121 shows, this process can lead all the way to release. In other words, cross-questioning the results of meditation in this manner fulfills two functions. It carries the questions of MN 61 to the most subtle levels of mental action, and it brings the duties of the Four Noble Truths all the way to their completion in full awakening. A striking feature of the Buddha's recommended course of self-cross-examination in general is the frequency with which the questions are framed in terms of I, me, my, and self. What, having been done by me, will be for my long-term benefit and happiness? This bodily action I want to perform, would it lead to self-affliction? Are there any evil, unskillful qualities unabandoned by me that would be an obstruction for me were I to die in the night? Can I fault myself with regard to my virtue? What am I becoming as the days and nights fly past? Beginning with the first of these questions, which the Buddha identified as most basic for the development of discernment, the perception of self is used in its two primary modes, as the potential producer of happiness, what having been done by me, and as the consumer or experiencer of happiness, my long-term benefit and happiness. Anyone familiar with the Buddha's teachings on not-self might find this way of framing questions strange, and yet it is not merely an artifact of grammatical conventions. These two modes of self-perception surround every desire, the sense that I, or those I cherish, will benefit from achieving the desired result. This is the consumer, and the sense that I, as the producer, will need to possess powers to bring it about. Because the path factor of right effort involves generating desire to develop skillful qualities and abandon unskillful ones, it inevitably involves the production of these two modes of self in a skillful, capable form. And passages in the discourses explicitly recommend doing just that. First, I as the consumer of happiness. And what is the self as a governing principle? There is the case where a monk, having gone to a wilderness, to the root of a tree, or to an empty dwelling, reflects on this. It's not for the sake of robes that I have gone forth from the home life into homelessness. It's not for the sake of alms food, for the sake of lodgings, or for the sake of this or that state of future becoming that I have gone forth from the home life into homelessness. Simply that I am beset by birth, aging, and death, by sorrows, lamentations, pains, distresses, and despairs, beset by stress, overcome with stress, and I hope, perhaps the end of this entire mass of suffering and stress might be known. Now, if I were to seek the same sort of sensual pleasures that I abandoned in going forth from home into homelessness, or a worse sort, that would not be fitting for me. So he reflects on this. My persistence will be aroused and not lax. My mindfulness established and not confused. My body calm and not aroused. My mind centered and unified. Having made his self his governing principle, he abandons what is unskillful, develops what is skillful, abandons what is blameworthy, develops what is unblameworthy, and looks after himself in a pure way. This is called the self as a governing principle. And 340. And then I as the producer of happiness. Then Ananda. This body comes into being through conceit, and yet it's by relying on conceit that conceit is to be abandoned. Thus it was said. And in reference to what was it said? There is the case, sister, where a monk hears, the monk named such and such, they say, through the ending of the fermentations, has entered and remains in the fermentation-free awareness release and discernment release, having directly known and realized them for himself right in the here and now. The thought occurs to him. The monk named such and such, they say, through the ending of the fermentations, has entered and remains in the fermentation-free awareness release and discernment release, having directly known and realized them for himself right in the here and now. Then why not me? Then, at a later time, he abandons conceit, having relied on conceit. And 159. As these examples show, perceptions of self, if used skillfully, are an important motivator for developing heedfulness and pursuing the process of self-cross-examination that fosters skillfulness in one's thoughts, words, and deeds. In the terms of Venn, Kamaka's analogy, a skillful sense of I am is like the salt earth or lye or cow dung used to wash a dirty cloth. However, in this process of self-cross-examination, the perception of self is not the prime focus of inquiry. Instead, the questions shift the focus from concern for self to concern for mastering the principle of cause and effect as it governs the results of actions. At the same time, the questions help blur the line between concern for one's own happiness and concern for the happiness of others. MN 61 recommends avoiding not only actions that would lead to self-affliction, but also those that would lead to the affliction of others, or of both. The qualities encouraged by the inquiry in AN 1051, being uncovetous, without thoughts of ill will, free of sloth and drowsiness, not restless, gone beyond uncertainty, not angry, with unsoiled thoughts, with one's body unaroused, with persistence aroused and concentrated, benefit not only the person practicing but also all the people with whom he or she comes into contact. The same holds true for the practices of generosity and virtue, on which the practice of meditation is based. Thus, happiness is not viewed as a zero-sum prospect. The more skillful one becomes, the wider the happiness spread by one's skill, and the more blurred the lines originally drawn by the categories of objectification between self and others. Because the process of self-cross-examination uses perceptions of self in this way to focus primary attention on actions, it inevitably leads the meditator to start viewing the perceptions of self as a type of action, what the texts call I-making and my-making. Because actions are judged by their skillfulness in producing desirable results, there inevitably comes the point where the question arises: to what extent is the activity of I-making and my-making genuinely skillful? In the course of the practice, one has been able to recognize many unskillful ways of creating a perception of I and my, and in the process of recognizing them, to drop them for more skillful ways of identifying oneself. But as the practice progresses, does one reach a point where any activity of I-making and my-making, regardless of how skillful, becomes an obstacle to further progress? Obviously, it has been useful in getting the mind firmly concentrated, but as MN 113 notes, If skill in the practice of concentration becomes a cause of self-exaltation, it interferes with further advances on the path. And as MN 102 notes, any sense of I am related to even the subtlest levels of concentration hides a remnant of clinging that stands in the way of full release. Thus, the process of self-cross-examination must now turn to examine the activities of I-making and my-making to take them apart. In the terms of Kamaka's analogy, now that the salt earth or lye or cow dung has succeeded in washing the cloth has to be put away in a perfumed hamper so that the lingering scent of the cleaning agents will fade away. As Kamaka says, this is done by focusing on the arising and passing away of the 5 clinging aggregates, the raw material both for concentrated states of mind and for the construction of any sense of self, in a way that removes any clinging around them. The questions of self-cross-examination designed to accomplish this task thus shift their framework to 3 perceptions: inconstancy, stress, and not self, which are applied either to the aggregates or to the sense media as they are directly experienced. In the case of the aggregates, each aggregate is examined with questions in this order. Is this constant or inconstant? Inconstant. And is that which is inconstant easeful or stressful? Stressful. And is it fitting to regard what is inconstant, stressful, subject to change as this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? No. To see in terms of these perceptions ultimately leads to a total abandoning of clinging for any of the aggregates, including the perception aggregate that accomplished this task, and the mind is released. In the case of the sense media, the same questionnaire is applied to each sense medium and to the events dependent on it in this order: the internal sense medium, e.g. the eye, the corresponding external sense medium, e.g. forms, consciousness at that medium, contact at that medium, and anything that arises dependent on that contact as a mode of feeling, perception, fabrication, or consciousness. Because the 5 physical senses are instances of the form aggregate, this version of the questionnaire, though focused on the sense media, manages to encompass all 5 aggregates as well. Notice that although this level of cross-examination has dropped any reference to self, it has maintained the framework of skillful and unskillful action. The last question in the series does not demand the conclusion that there is no self. Instead, it asks simply whether it is fitting, skillful, to identify an inconstant, stressful event as oneself. In other words, the Buddha is not asking one to come to a metaphysical conclusion on the question, created by objectification, as to the existence or non-existence of the self. After all, as we saw in the discussion of SN 1215 in Chapter 3, the mind on the verge of awakening doesn't see the world in terms of existence or non-existence in any event. So the question of the existence or non-existence of the self would be irrelevant. Thus, instead of pushing the questioning into the realm of objectification, the Buddha is simply pushing the line of inquiry about skillful action to its subtlest level, the act of self-identification, at the same time raising the pragmatic standard of what counts as skillful so as to abandon all acts of self-identification and attain total freedom. This point is made dramatically in MN 109, which we identified above as the concluding passage where the Buddha puts aside a question and proceeds to lead his listeners in the process of self-cross-examination leading to release. In this passage, a monk, hearing that the 5 aggregates are not self, asks himself the sort of question that is often heard in introductory academic courses on Buddhism. If there is no self, then, in this case, the monk's question is, so, form is not self, feeling is not self, perception is not self, fabrications are not self, consciousness is not self. Then what self will be touched by the actions done by what is not self? In other words, the monk apparently sees in the not-self teaching an opening to deny that anyone will receive the results of karma, a notion that can short-circuit any attempt to abandon unskillful karma and to develop skillful karma in its place. The Buddha, reading the monk's mind, denounces the question and, putting it aside, engages all the monks in the line of cross-questioning introduced in SN 2259. In doing so, he is demonstrating the proper way to use the perception of not-self, not to draw metaphysical conclusions, but to question the skillfulness of the actions of I-making and my-making, so that those actions can be dropped and liberation found. This is precisely what happens during this discourse. 60 monks gain total release. A similar process is recorded more systematically in AN 936. There, the Buddha recommends that when a meditator has mastered any of the meditative absorptions, she should look for the way in which that absorption is composed of the activities of the aggregates. Once these activities are detected, they should be viewed not only as inconstant, stressful, and not self, but also as a disease, a cancer, an arrow, painful, an affliction, alien, a disintegration, an emptiness. In other words, one should learn to regard them in a way that induces a sense of disenchantment and dispassion for them, so that one will lose all interest in continuing to engage in the attempt to find happiness in anything at all that is intended or fabricated. A similar point is made at the end of MN 121. Because all other avenues toward happiness have now been shut off, the mind inclines toward a happiness totally unfabricated. If it can maintain that stance, an opening to full awakening can occur. Now it is entirely possible that the mind pursuing this line of cross-questioning may not have the powers of concentration and discernment needed to abandon all clinging. As a 936 points out, even if one can maintain a stance inclined toward the deathless, a remnant of passion and delight for that Dhamma might still prevent full awakening, leading instead to the penultimate attainment of non-return. And as MN 106 shows, there are cases where the perception of not-self doesn't even lead that far, arriving instead only at refined states of concentration. Thus, the final set of questions in self-cross-examination gives guidelines for evaluating one's attainment. Although the criteria for coming to the conclusion that one is an arahant, as phrased in, are not expressed as questions, there are questions implicit behind them. And although the evaluation employs the terms I am, this is one case where this phrase is purely a grammatical convention, for the arahant has no further use for conceit at all. In this way, the process of cross-questioning functions not only to yield progress on the path, but also to evaluate the goal after it is reached. In other words, there is no level of the practice where it is inappropriate to pose questions in a skillful way. Anything that cannot stand up to questioning can't be genuine Dhamma. If anything is genuine Dhamma, it is sure to pass the test. As we saw in Chapter 2, the Buddha's quest for awakening was primarily a process of cross-questioning in various forms. The same is true for anyone following the Buddha's path. And as a number of discourses show, the various forms of cross-questioning are mutually supportive in this endeavor. A primary example is EN 109. It begins with an anonymous monk cross-questioning the Buddha on the meaning of his teachings. The Buddha's openness to questioning, in turn, provides an atmosphere conducive for the monks to gain awakening as he cross-questions them on the activity of I-making and my-making occurring in their minds. 3 other discourses show how the Buddha's students were also able to combine various forms of cross-questioning to good effect. In MN 84, King Kauravya cross-questions Venrathapala about the meaning of the Buddha's teachings that led the latter to ordain. The king is portrayed as an amiable but very unenlightened individual, something of a spiritual innocent. To make his points, Rathabhala is forced to draw simple examples from the king's own life and to cross-question him about them. And as often happens when innocent people ask questions on basic matters, the discussion reveals a fundamental point. In this case, the parallel between the facts of aging, illness, and death on the one hand, and the perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self on the other. Nowhere else in the discourses is this parallel drawn so clearly. In MN 146, Nandaka teaches a group of nuns with what he calls a cross-questioning talk, inviting them to question him on any statement they don't understand. None of them take advantage of the invitation, but, as they remark, they appreciate his openness. He then employs two other types of cross-questioning. One, asking them to examine the activity of eye-making with regard to the six sense media, and two, cross-questioning them on the analogies with which he illustrates his points. The discourse states that the first time he does this, the nuns do not achieve awakening. However, the Buddha asks him to repeat the talk 2 weeks later, and this time even the most backward of the nuns achieves stream entry. A similar atmosphere of openness prevails in SN 22-89, where a group of elder monks cross-question Kamaka about his level of attainment, apparently a common occurrence among the monks when one of them was seriously ill. As they ask him to explain what is essentially the non-returner's remnant of conceit, he illustrates his points with hypothetical analogies, on which he cross-questions them. The process proves so clarifying that monks on both sides of the exchange, 60 of the elders and Kamaka himself, achieve full awakening. These examples illustrate three important points. The first is that the various modes of cross-questioning are mutually reinforcing, establishing an atmosphere of respect, trust, and openness in which the responsible exchange of ideas is conducive to clarity. The second is that, although self-cross-examination is the primary mode leading directly to awakening, other modes of cross-questioning, such as questioning a speaker and exploring hypotheticals, can lead directly to awakening as well. However, it is likely that these modes of cross-questioning inspired the individuals involved to engage simultaneously in self-cross-examination, reflecting on how the lessons they were learning applied directly to what they were experiencing in their minds. Finally, these examples show that the Buddha was able to pass some of his skill in cross-questioning on to his students, as a distinctive rhetorical approach conducive to keeping the quest for awakening alive.